It's ancient monsters in modern times, where Frank fails his sanity roll again, and again, and again. Cell phones aren't all they're cracked up to be. Jim's characters are dropping like flies, and John, well, he's a dick. Put on your investigators' hats and join us as we dive into the unknown realms of Call of Cthulhu.
Welcome to Roleplay Geeks. This is Frank.
This is your token hippie, John.
I'm Jim.
This is Steve.
And this is Stevo, a.k.a. the other Steve.
I'm Jack. Just Jack.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about a campaign that we've been going through the last couple weeks or so with Steve Hill. And this is a Call of Cthulhu campaign. Now, this is relatively new, I think, for all of us, despite the fact that this game has been around a really long time. It's been, I think the first edition was published in 1981. So this has existed as a game we could have been playing from the overwhelming majority of our career as role players. And it's up to the 7th edition, which came out not too long ago. And that's the edition that we've been playing. This has been a very new experience, I think, for all of us, because it's kind of a different genre than we've been used to playing. Most of the time we typically play, as I think I'm going to go ahead and guess, the overwhelming majority of players out there are playing fantasy or science fiction. This is a different genre. It's a sort of a horror genre, which has been very intriguing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that campaign today. I
have to say that I never, I think we tried to play Call of Cthulhu or something similar to it maybe, but a few years ago, wasn't it? Maybe 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, so Jimmy ran a Call of Cthulhu campaign for about 17 minutes.
Right.
It was terrible.
Right, yeah.
I remember, and that one was set in the 20s.
Right, we did
as traditional. So Call of Cthulhu is based upon H.P. Lovecraft, and Stevo could talk more about that because he knows vastly more about that than I've ever.
Right. So H.P. Lovecraft is categorized more as weird fiction today. And he published his first story probably around 1915 and published several novellas, short stories, mostly published in Weird Tales. And he continued publishing up until 1937 when he passed away at the age of 46. So, but he's most known for creating what's called the Cthulhu mythos. And many of his stories and also a lot of other authors of the era based their work on this mythos. This mythos, the Cthulhu mythos, is that there's these alien beings, evil beings all over the earth that have been here since before the age of the dinosaurs. Most are in some type of slumber, and there are cults that worship these beings that are reaching out to them mentally in dreams, so on and so forth. And the cults are trying to bring about the raising of these beings to wake them up and bring on a new era, so on and so forth, of destruction, chaos. So instead of the typical horror that you're used to of maybe the priest doing the exorcism, the devil, demons, or jump scares with vampires, werewolves, and just crazy slashers, this is all based around this mythos, which is what I really like, because then you have real magic, all those kind of things but you can make it very, very mysterious as you're rolling it out.
Yeah, so, I think of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this is a genre that I know very little about. It's not one that I personally gravitate very much, is the horror genre. It's not a thing I care for in books or film or anything. But I kind of think of them as sort of a separate pillar, but almost equally as important as Poe. So if, like 100 years later, Edgar Allan Poe is reborn as H.P. Lovecraft.
Well, that's what H.P. Lovecraft was inspired by. He really loved Poe's stuff, and he loved the horror of the unknown, which is what everything's based around.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
There's
so
I don't remember the quote.
I believe it's the oldest fear of mankind is that of the unknown. It was something around those lines.
So, if you're into that sort of thing, it's a very rich, I think is the word I want to use, era for storytelling. And there's a lot of ways that you can take this if you wanted to do something like an adventure. There's plenty of stories that one could tap into. And this is, so a rough contemporary of H.P. Lovecraft would have been the Conan books. So the initial runs of those. So it was a period in literature where people were actually starting to explore a little bit of this unknown as something that could be true, and mix this with the modern era of the modern scientific technical understanding of the world. And I think it presents a really compelling, rich tapestry that you can tap into, because it allows you to have one foot in the metaphysical and one foot in the practical. And that's not something you typically get in other genres we have in role playing, because in science fiction, it tends to be science, right? So you have to be scientifically plausible in some form or fashion. In fantasy, it's all, wave your hands, it's magic. That's how come. This bridges that. I find it a fascinating genre, construct that you can make some really cool stories from.
Mm-hmm. Because it's scientifically possible with like that bits of science that you put in there. But, it's fiction.
Let's talk about the campaign that we're going through specifically. So this one is a modern setting of H.P. Lovecraft. And Steve, why did you pick that?
Oh, well, Steve Marr had something he wanted to say earlier. I saw him raise his hand.
I'm sorry. It was hidden slightly by the window.
So there's an article that I had read in the New Republic Online by a guy named John Bray. And the title of the article is H.P. Lovecraft Invented a Horrific World to Escape a Nihilistic Universe. And kind of his interpretation of what H.P. Lovecraft thinks about humans. And the line is, the human mind is an accident in the universe, which is indifferent to the welfare of the species. So
that sounds like H.P. Lovecraft.
Absolutely. Yeah. That there are forces, both of nature and alien, that have got to exist in this, at the time, an expanding universe. H.P. was born in the 1890s, and the scientific, social, industrial explosion from the time he was born to the time he died was incredible. And he had the works of other people to build on. And his fiction was different in such a way that, we've mentioned Poe. So if you think about Poe and his contemporaries, the stories that they wrote were really grounded in ghost stories and murder and betrayal and mystery of a type that was more rattling chains than it was aliens at your doorstep. So an advancement from that up a level, and I've mentioned before Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because of the influences that she had around her, the theories of evolution that were coming through, and, whether some races were more superior than others, things that were happening in science at the time inspired her to write Frankenstein. And Frankenstein is a slightly different form of fiction. It harkens back to the tales of the golem in Hebrew mythos. But there is this science bent that wasn't there in fictions before. So then you have H.P. coming along, and he takes it another step and removes it from the human race entirely and constructs this world of things that are so far out of our comprehension that in some cases it breaks our mind. And that's one of the core mechanics to the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, which I actually have played quite a few times over the past 3 decades. And in all of the campaigns that I've played in, the, kind of mechanics of the game all kind of go away. And at some point, your sanity, becomes the core concept in the game driving it forward. And there wasn't anybody that I'm aware of that wrote like this until H.P. came along.
Yeah, it's kind of like music before the Beatles changed everything.
Right. And you've got everybody from Stephen King to John Carpenter. You have, things that have happened in television shows and movies that absolutely would not be there without H.P.'s influence.
Absolutely. Very influential.
I have to say really quick, I really appreciate that you're wearing your Cthulhu shirt, Steve.
I know. Thank you. I was wondering if anybody was going to say anything.
Yeah, I was
Thank
trying
you
to
so
wait for
much.
you guys to finish talking before
Oh.
I said something, but it's really awesome.
I thought it was a green sperm captured by some LED light strips.
It is H.P.
Same
Lovecraft
thing.
then.
H.P. Lovecraft, yeah.
Yeah, it is. Totally. For our listeners who do not have a visual cue, the shirt I'm wearing is from, where is it from? Oh shit, it's my favorite place to get
We'll put it up on the Instagram.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
And then you guys can go there and see it.
Okay, so that's the literary backdrop, if you will, of the game itself. And again, it's a rich tapestry you can draw from, and it's very influential into a lot of modern day fiction, which is part of the reason that it creates a very deep well that one can draw from to make your own game fiction. So let's talk a little bit about the game fiction that we've been engaged in the last couple weeks, which is Steve Hill's campaign. And again, our version is set in the modern day as opposed to what would have been H.P. Lovecraft's modern day of the 20s. And it's a little bit different, but it is essentially the same forms and functions that surround it. So why did you choose a modern day for this, Steve?
I don't know. I ran this game years ago when it first came out, and I've always done modern. I think it makes it easier for everyone to relate to. You guys, for instance, you create your characters and you kind of get in the groove. You know what it's like to live in the modern day. And so what I want to do is break that slowly, break into the unusual, the weird as we go along. I feel that the 1920s would be fun because it makes it more of a fantasy, even though it's based on history, it makes it more of a fantasy type setting because we've never lived in the 1920s. So we can invent whatever we want there. Maybe base it on
yourself.
Well, yeah. I forgot you were immortal, John.
Yeah, so I want to go on a little side editorial here. I've always been very fascinated by the 20s, the interwar period, essentially, which is the 20s and 30s as a literary time frame. It's intriguing to me that you've got the utter destruction of World War I and having to deal with the psychological impact of the utter destruction, that widespread destruction that hits the majority of the world, well, the Western world. And then it creates this chaos that builds to World War II. And then you've got a Great Depression in there. And on top of that, we really start to span a bit of the, if you will, the eras of the modern scientific understanding of the world and what we can and can't positively say compared to the sort of mythos, mystical belief that there are things that control the universe. Now, some of that, of course, some people do still, even in this modern day, believe that sort of mythical stuff. Other people, didn't believe it at that time. So it's not like it's cut and dry, but it does present an interesting time period where I think there's a lot of direction you can go and a lot of conflict you can draw from. So I can see why Call of Cthulhu fits so nicely into that era in the traditional sense. But that being said, I don't think that it doesn't work in the modern setting almost as well for some of the same reasons. We don't have world wars to draw from, but we do have a lot of, post-Cold War anxiety. We don't know what the 21st century looks like. All of our visions, science fiction based visions of the 21st century are some sort of dystopia that hasn't quite manifested itself yet. But with things like the pandemic, we start feeling like maybe they're on the edge, and it creates this anxiety. So I think it's a really compelling to move it to the modern day, even now. So that was just an editorial comment.
Right. And just real quickly, it is relatively popular. I'd say it's more popular to run these games in the 1920s because most of the supplements and modules and things are based there. If you're going to buy something from Chaosium, it's going to be 1925. But I do know that a lot of people make it a modern campaign. There are supplements out there that's been published through the many years that set it in the modern era. There's one called something green. I wish I would have remembered, didn't write it down. That's some huge supplement that takes everything from H.P. Lovecraft's time all the way to modern era and takes into account things like the Roswell UFOs, all of the mysterious things that's happened since H.P. Lovecraft's time. But another reason to set it in the 1920s is because the world was still a pretty mysterious place back then. For instance, H.P. Lovecraft wrote one of his more famous short novels is called At the Mountains of Madness, and that's a group of explorers in Antarctica. At that time, Antarctica had barely been explored, had not been fully mapped. Today, you can look at it on Google Earth, right? You know what's there. You know if there's mountains there. And so I think setting it in the 1920s, you can make an alternate history, discoveries that still haven't been discovered yet. Whereas setting it in the modern era can be more of a challenge, just as if when you guys were going through the woods, you were wanting to refer to GPS data and things like that, things that wouldn't have existed in the 1920s. So I don't know why I said it in modern era. I think, again, I try to make it a comfortable place that suddenly all this mystery starts happening. I want everyone to have a compelling backstory and reasons for meeting together and coming to the town Arkham, and then we start breaking reality a bit. That was my reason.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Well, I noticed that kind of quickly you ended up, a couple of times when we did, just trying to call in an ambulance or call in this. It's like, oh, no cell phone service. It's like, oh, it's like a horror movie, modern day horror movies. Oh, man, my cell phone isn't working. What's going on? So, yeah,
Yep.
because that's one of those things. I've kind of noticed that in horror movies and things, that the cell phone is one of these things that can
make or break.
Yeah, it kind of very much breaks some horror aspects because, well, you could call and get help kind of quickly now. They can get your GPS position. You can have a better idea of, they got flashlights. They got all sorts of stuff on them. It's huge. You can get in touch with somebody instead of like, well, I hope he comes back soon. Well, you can just call and go, hey, are you coming back soon? It's one of those things, but it's a good thing to do. Oh, just no cell phone coverage.
Well, 3 days hike into the wilderness is why you have no cell phone service.
Right,
so,
exactly, yeah.
I mean, I don't know about
a good thing to do.
I don't know about your cell phone service, but in where I live, if I get off any main road that has a painted line, I have no cell phone service, literally. Just about anywhere in this county. I don't think that's a stretch.
Well, you can always set it in Green Bank, and then you don't have the problem at all. Green Bank, West Virginia, no cell service there at all.
That's correct.
Green Bank, for those who don't know, is a radio telescope array in West Virginia in the Appalachians that is a radio dead zone. They have restrictions on any kind of broadcasts that can be done. And when you're there, because the equipment is so sensitive, you are supposed to turn off your cell phones, not use the radio in your car, things like that. Nowadays, they have really amazing noise filtering computer programs that are tuned for that kind of thing. But back in the day, it was really a detriment if anyone came to visit. It's a huge, wide, flat Highland Valley, and it's featured in Fallout 76 as well.
Very nice.
While we were on that note of everyone, getting the players together and the phone service and all that, that's actually when I was DMing once before I started playing with you guys, I purposely chose 1920s with my players, and I found it much easier because I had them all on a train and there's no cell service whatsoever, and I easily had a situation where they went into the mountains of snow and the train happened to crash, and now they're abandoned all alone in an isolated mountain, and there's no phone service, no helicopters or anything, so they had to go and hike to find safety. And I found that much more scary than, oh, let me go call my family members. I just need to go get some help.
Right. Well, I will say this. I did ask all you guys before we started. I said, would you guys prefer that I make the game in the 1920s? Because I've read quite a bit of 20th century history. I would have no issue. The interwar period, things that we're talking about, I would have had no issue running the game there. And all you guys said you didn't care one way or the other.
Yeah.
If even one of you guys would have said, yeah, let's do one in the 1920s, that would be cool, then I would have done it.
I was intrigued with what you would do if you did in modern times, because I've only seen 1920s when it came to Call of Cthulhu.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the play style. So it's a very different play style than most role-playing games lend themselves to. At some level, fantasy tends to be hack and slash, right? I mean, it tends to be a little more action oriented. Oftentimes, not always exclusively, whereas Call of Cthulhu really doesn't lend itself well, in my opinion, thus far in my experience, to doing an action oriented game. It requires a lot more, a different type of play style. So what do you guys think about that? And how is that working for you?
I was always scared. I was cautious. I wanted a bookshelf near every single door.
I have a question for Stevo. What do you do? It seemed like, maybe it was just me, but it seemed like pretty often we would fail our roles, and particularly things like investigation. So you want the story to progress, but everybody keeps failing their investigation roles, for example. Did it feel like that with you, and did that create some difficulties in moving the story forward at some points?
Well, sometimes, and it all depends. I know some DMs like using secret roles, things like that, so you don't know whether you failed or not. Sometimes you guys just say, hey, I want to spot hidden, or I want to investigate this or whatever. Then you roll, and maybe there's nothing there. But if you fail your roll anyway, then you're like, I don't know, is something here? You don't know. I will say if it's something important to the plot, I will say I won't have you roll a spot hidden. I mean, if it's important to move the story forward, I'm just going to say you look over in the corner and you see something, right, or whatever. But then there's things, usually, for instance, I had Frank missed his history roll 3 or 4 times on just a piece of history that added some richness to the story, and he finally got it last night. I just had him re-roll it over the span of a few sessions, had him re-roll it and say that name comes from somewhere, and then he would fail his history roll, and that would be it for the night. And then finally he succeeded, and he remembered that. But that wasn't important to the plot. That was just a little piece of history that add some flavor to the game.
Yeah, he fails the role because he's a professor at a 3rd tier community college. So it's not surprising.
A small liberal arts college.
I rest my case.
Very respected in its respective community. Thank you very much. We have an excellent volleyball team
in Maine.
Award-winning volleyball. We are ranked 3.
They wear long johns when they play.
I will have to say that going back to Frank's question, I really kind of liked it. It's been more like my character's a private eye, and it started off where I was trying to find this girl.
He's a private
I'm a private dick.
Yes.
And I was trying to find the sister of my best friend who had died. And her parents had called me. She was missing, or they hadn't heard from her in a while. They were really worried. And so it wasn't me running around with a gun and shooting up stuff. It was me investigating things, trying to find things, and questioning people and trying to get on some sort of trail to find out where this girl's gone, and then noticing that people are acting kind of odd or seem scared to talk to me about some things. So then I'm breaking into places. If I can't get in legally, I'm breaking in and then investigating and finding all this strange stuff, and kind of like, oh man, it sounds like she's wrapped up in some cult. And it was really fun. It was completely different. I really enjoyed it. It was a completely different thing than, I'm a fighter and I've got my sword and I'm going to whack that ogre on the head. I mean, it was completely different, and it was fun. It was, I actually, have found it to be a nice change of pace. And I have to say, I'm always very interested in the mechanics of a new system. And it's a very simple, overall, a pretty simple system, Call of Cthulhu, at least this 7th edition that we're playing. But I like it. I think it's simple, and it gets skills across for your character to use. It's very easy to roll resolution on things. You don't have a lot of hit points, so you start playing with guns, people going to die. I like that. I like that it's that.
Jimmy. He means Jimmy is going to die.
I like playing both of my characters. My first,
I was always scared, man.
Yeah. I'm really interested in what your 3rd character is going to be.
I know, it's going to be
that's going to be cool.
There's not much plot left, so.
Yeah, my first character is currently being fitted for a colostomy bag at the local hospital. And my second character is a coward. I like him.
Okay. Okay, so I think John brought up an interesting thing, mechanics. I want to get back to that. But Steve Marr, you didn't really. How are you finding the game?
Fine. No, I'm enjoying it. I've played Call of Cthulhu before, so there's and I'm familiar with the mythos, and I don't know.
Did you ever play in the present time, or did you always play 1920s Call of Cthulhu in your previous
To be
ones
honest,
that you played?
mostly it was present time.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's different.
the last one that I played was a one-shot, oh God, a few years ago, and it was a military group that was going on an extraction mission, and all hell broke loose. So, for me, I don't think necessarily, as far as Cthulhu mythos goes, as far as a Lovecraft story goes, I don't lose a lot of the mystery that you might think by having it in modern day because of technology, because the modern day is full of psychological illness disorders. You've got people on antidepressants, anti-anxiety medicines, anti-schizophrenic. The mind has only gotten worse over time. We treat the mind with drugs that when you get off, you're worse. They don't cure, they, kind of sustain or put off.
They numb.
Yeah. So as someone who's been on antidepressants and anti-anxieties for now the majority of my life, the mind is where all of this happens. And just because you have access to a technology in a Lovecraftian universe, that doesn't matter. So I enjoy it being in the modern day. I've enjoyed the game, but I don't have anything, kind of to add to it like you guys are, because it's a lot newer to you guys in this context.
I will have to say one thing going along what you're saying there is that because the modern day zeitgeist is that we know everything, there's very little mysteries left to know, and
Not
so
anymore.
when you break that reality, then it's like, what? Head explodes. Kind of. This is everything's these are things we thought we absolutely knew for a fact. And what, there's these beings that can, it just becomes a huge muddled mess in your brain.
That's where
I think it's really neat. Go ahead.
That's where I like to bring up sanity. Those were probably my favorite moments. Whenever sanity was rolled and it failed, I loved those the most. Oh yeah, because it does proper character development if your sanity go down, because it actively affects you during the game, and it also gave some funny moments, like when Frank was screaming, "This isn't real! This isn't real!" over and over and over again when we saw the animated corpses.
Yeah,
that was actually my favorite bit of role playing in the game so far.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Frank's reactions, and that in all the games that we've gamed together, that's probably my favorite bit of role playing you've done,
Frank,
which I've really enjoyed. But I tell you what, Jimmy keeps leaning into the mic like he remembered to say something. I know that if we put it off far too long, he's just gonna stay there. And
You're presuming.
Forget.
You're presuming that he remembered to say something. You're not presuming every time he leans away, it's a reset, and there's a new thing that he's already forgotten. There's other 4 times he's leaned into the mic.
Yep, Frank is absolutely right. That's exactly how it works with me. And I forgot what I was going to say.
Oh, a new thing. Oh, that's gone. Oh, a new thing. Oh, he's like a goldfish.
And I forgot what I was going to say.
There you go.
So yeah, Jack touched on something that maybe if you're unfamiliar with Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, one of the big things is sanity. You have to make most of the time that you see something very unusual, for instance, the incident that Stephen just brought up was Frank's character seeing an animated corpse. Well, all of the characters have to make a sanity roll because they're seeing something that shouldn't exist, right? So that's and the reason that's in the game is because that's a big part of many H.P. Lovecraft stories is the characters start losing their mind as whatever events go through. They start becoming insane. So Frank failed his sanity roll. And so
epically failed my sanity. I rolled like a critical failure. It's major.
So in the game, you roll a D10, and they can actually develop a phobia or some type of mania from that, a permanent one. And in Frank's case, I don't remember, maybe just some catatonic state or something. But anyway, he role played it. So, and it makes it a lot of fun. I mean, as a game master, when that happens, the player can either role play it the way Frank did, or can say, well, you can't do anything right now. You're losing your mind. But Frank, took it off and he role played very well, knew that he, would sit down and just freak out. So that makes for some fun moments for sure.
Oh, yeah. Happened to me once, and I just ran out of the room cursing, and I never just stopped running.
That's right. Last night, I think.
Yeah, that's what happens when you sit on top of a zombie.
It was a coffin. Anyways.
So let's talk a little more about the sanity mechanics. So John brought up the mechanics, which we didn't talk about those too extensively. So let's take a second to talk about that. Essentially, this is a D100 based system. So you roll percentile dice. And this is the thing this aspect I don't care for personally, but it's semantics. Rolling low is good. Rolling high is bad in this game. More often than not, in a percentile based system, 100 is a better roll than a 1. This has that flip. And so the thing is that you've got stats and abilities and skills that are also percentile based. And every time, you guys have to remind me because I don't remember, a high number in history, for example, does what to my roll? I
actually never remembered that.
Yeah, this is one of my problems is that high is good is easy for me, but rolling low is good, but my number is high. So what do I do with the... And this is one of my problems with the game.
Oh, you meant about upgrading your skill?
It's not consistent.
No, he's talking about just success in a skill or combat. The design is to roll low under your modified score, not to roll above it. You need to roll below
when you're trying to increase your skill, you need to roll above it.
Yeah,
so it's inconsistent in that. Now the thing is, it makes sense and it works okay and stuff, but it is an inconsistency that probably first time players might be confused about.
I mean, I remember when I was like a year ago when I was GMing my game, I was going through the handbook, and I'm like, okay, so this is how I play the game. I have to roll lower. Okay. Because all my games up to this point were, you need to roll high, They bashed that into my head. It was a real change.
Right.
The concept of having to roll higher to increase your skill that you normally have to roll under to succeed on, I think is great, because it is harder to increase your skill in something the more skilled you are at it,
right?
Meaningfully. So, those new discoveries come fewer and far between.
Mm-hmm.
You take someone like Stephen Hawking, whose, brain is larger than his whole body, and he has things that he builds on. So you learn all of these little things with those aha moments and those giant leaps in learning come after the cumulative effect of everything else. And they're much harder to achieve as you get further on.
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with that part. It's just remembering my score goes up and I have to roll, wait a minute. And then there's the half and then there's a quarter score. And if you have good tools, like we have a good PDF that does the math for you, which is quite nice. But because it's a low base thing, for me personally, I find I stare at this and go, wait a minute, hold on. I got to get above this to what I have to think for a few more seconds than I'm used to. That's all. It's a very minor complaint, but it is.
I mean, it's still a complaint.
The mechanics are a bit different than most of the mechanics that I'm used to in similar based systems.
I found the HP was really good. That gave more of a horror aspect for me, at least. I was skitterish all the time. Because I knew one hit could kill me, and then I have to make a new character.
Or land you in a hospital for a colostomy bag.
Right.
So this game is designed to the player characters are known as investigators. So I think that explains a little bit about it. The way the game is set up. Typically, if you were to buy a module, there's going to be some type of mystery, some goings on, and then there has to be, and the player characters have different skills like library use and things like that to investigate, find out what's at the bottom of the mystery. So there's a lot of talk, role playing, things that are not, let's just crawl through a tunnel and shoot things. There's a lot of that. And I've found the way I tried to set my game up, I set it up as a little action piece right off the bat. Now, I had solo sessions with everyone to fill out a backstory, a strong backstory for each character, except for you, Jack. You kind of came late to the game.
Yep.
And then so everyone had their own motivations to be in the town and to be where they were. They could share them or not, but it helped, I think, the role-playing aspect of it. And so I set up, when the group first got together, I set up kind of an action piece, a little piece to kind of bring them together into some combat and things like that, things beyond belief. And then there went into another investigation period as a strange cult was in town looking for the girl. Jimmy's character had his own motivations, and so if you're going to run one of these, and I think that helped build up to the scarier portions or the combat portions. So I tried to have a deep investigation for a night or two, and then a good action one every two or third one. And sometimes you guys take a lot longer. Like last night, you guys took much longer. We could have probably finished the campaign last night, but you guys actually took quite a bit of time in that cabin.
It was me staying in the coffin.
Being scared to death, really. Being very, very, very cautious. And actually, that's great. It tells me that I'm doing my job as a game master, because you guys are pretty skittish when it comes to investigating these things.
I was convinced that if we did not deal with whatever was in the coffin, it was going to follow us.
Yeah, well, you know,
Really?
Troy.
Well, you never know.
You know, Troy, my character was a big fan of the Evil Dead, so that's why he was skittish.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So that's been a lot of fun, seeing the way you guys react to different situations. You guys have been role-playing it great and have been very skittish and nervous for the most part. So I think we
raises another issue that I wanted to talk about, which is one of the things I think that would be challenging, looking at this from a dungeon master's point of view or game master's point of view, is, and I don't think I would ever run Call of Cthulhu ever. I just don't think I'm capable of doing that. And part of the reason is I think it's really challenging to balance allowing the players to be engaged at the level they want to in Rails. So the thing is that you've got a story, and you as a game master, because as Steve said, you're investigators, your players are. So there's obviously some sort of mystery, something to discover and pull out. And you've got to present it in such a way that there is a way for them to explore it, and they have latitude to explore it the way they want to, yet they find the things that they're supposed to so they can move forward. And I think that takes a bit of real skill to do well. And it seems to have gone well from my perspective thus far. But what do you guys think about that? The rest of you, that's not Steve.
I agreed with you until I ran it. I ran a game, and like I said before, train and all that. I made the investigation the main conflict, where the investigation was who's the monster. It was like The Thing, where it was a skin crawler / Wendigo creature I created that was taking the skins of the passengers, and the point is everyone's supposed to get off. And so that was the main conflict, was it could be action and mystery based at the same time. So that's my take on it. It was hard for me, but I was able to pull it off.
What was the question again?
Well, actually,
love you, man.
Actually, I think that your insight was going to be great here. Is that, you know, how do you run this as not so much on Rails, yet you've got a very definitive story that you have to run through. And since you attempted,
And he wanted to hear from someone other than me.
Right, because you're going to be last since you're going through it actively.
I just told my cut. I just made the mystery and the conflict the exact same thing.
I'm thinking through it, trying to wrap my mind around
The question?
Yeah, the question.
Well, okay, let's make it a little more basic. Do you think this game lends itself to playing on rails more than other games?
I think it's
What-
just the game. It's
So I'm off base here. You don't think it has any relevance to any of it?
it could. I mean, maybe it does lend itself to being on rails in some respects, but no, I don't think so. I think it's just really the game master can control that.
I think also it kind of depends on if you do modern 20 as well. You can kind of shoehorn things down in the 20s maybe. Because there is, less, well, for one thing, I mean, again, since we haven't lived through, a lot of characters would be like, or a lot of players would not know enough to, I think they'd be stumbling around in the 20s, as it were, versus, a present day Cthulhu. So I think you could control them a little bit better in the 20s than you could in modern day. But I don't think otherwise it's that big of a deal, really. I don't know if it really lends itself to it.
I just think that you always have the story you want to tell, and so that's an outline. You have the key points you want to hit. Players take it off the rails however they want to, and your job as a game master is just figure out how to get them to that next plot point. You either have to change the plot point or change the direction off the rails that the people going and make them circle back around to that plot point. And that's true of every game I've ever run. So I think I don't know that the challenge is any more difficult. It might be. I think that's more the game master determines whether it's more difficult or not. Game masters really, who are really good at, doing their job, it's not that difficult. New game masters might struggle more with it.
And, another thing is just because it is Call of Cthulhu, it is this H.P. Lovecraft based weirdness. It actually would be like, you're basically throwing the characters into a fun house and you just lock the doors and they just keep going through the same thing again until you get them to where you want them to go into that plot point. I mean, really, you can probably control them a lot easier than this just because of that sanity issue. And some of the, horror, mind-bending craziness of the whole system itself, I think kind of lends itself to getting them exactly where you want them, or at least a little bit easier than other things. I know that when we've played some of your D&D stuff, Frank, you've complained that you guys completely you're supposed to go through so-and-so and you guys you went over the mountain, you were supposed to go down the stream or, some weird thing like that. And in this, I think you'd have a little bit easier time just to go, like for one example, when we played the other night, not the last night we did, but the night before that, we were walking through a forest and Steve said, you wake up. And we're like, no, we were walking through the forest. He's like, you just wake up. You don't remember making camp. You don't remember eating. You don't remember anything else. You just wake up and you're here. And I was like, and we just accept that because, well, everything's been crazy. We saw things that we should never see. We saw some corpses stand up and start lumbering towards us or whatever. And I think that's one of the things is that you can make it run on rails if you want, or at least, take a sledgehammer to the characters and they'll accept it because, well, sledgehammers are part of the world now.
So what you're saying is the old quote that the difference between fiction and truth is that fiction has to make sense unless it's HP.
Right. Yeah.
Steven, your thoughts?
So there's a quote I was trying to find because I couldn't remember it verbatim, but it's from the opening of Call of Cthulhu. And the line from the paragraph is, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far." And that, to me, is kind of the core of H.P. Lovecraft and the core of the Call of Cthulhu game. So when you're talking about on rails versus, giving people more freedom, you have to have, as a game master, a level of competence and knowledge and expertise in the world that you're presenting. In Call of Cthulhu, that's especially important because it's grounded in the real world. And if you are having players that have metagaming knowledge like nerds do, we're not normal people. We know a lot of stuff. We usually have a pretty good grasp on what the scientific method is. We're up to date with technology. We know things. All right, I've said this before.
Did you? Whoa! Did you say? Did you say that
Yes.
we're nerds? We're normal people.
We're not normal people.
Okay, good.
Not.
Because
Not.
I was getting a little confused there for a minute. I missed the not.
Not.
Okay,
Not.
I'm back
Not
on.
normal.
I'm back on track. Sorry.
There you go.
You have a problem with hearing things like myths
Right.
and monsters.
Myths and monsters.
So you've got to create something for the players that gives them motivation to continue. And Steve's been doing a good job with that. Steve knows the material, and he knows, how to construct a narrative that we can follow that screws with our out-of-game brains. Now, taking it back to the 1920s is kind of a cop-out for me now, because all you're doing is you're removing, what have now become tropes and standards. You're just removing them, and you're giving the characters a forced ignorance, which can sometimes be very frustrating as a player, because you just know. I mean, you think about all the things that we know. It's so hard for new horror writers to come up with something new and fresh that isn't just a rehash. Just like the hero myths that we talked about before. People are building on these things, and over time, the amount of information in the population becomes so saturated and so well known that there isn't a lot of room for something new. It's just hard to create. If you take Stranger Things, which Stranger Things would not have existed without H.P. Lovecraft. The whole concept of the upside down, that you are kind of floating on this sea, and you really weren't meant to go too far away from where you started, because you are just a speck on the skin of a rock, and these other things swim in an ocean that we just have no chance of surviving. Anyway, the possibility of creating a game of Call of Cthulhu in modern times is actually more enjoyable for me, because you have to go deeper inside, and you have to come across things that have answers to the fallback technologies like the cell phones that we have. You can easily take that away because you're on a hike in the Cascades, for instance. But I'd rather have that than somebody artificially taking it away by just dumping me in the 20.
And you know what? A great thing about all of that is that the metagaming aspect of it, I guess we've touched on this already, but I love that. I just really thought about it a little bit more deeply just now because I'm slow. But that metagaming aspect, it's really awesome from a player's perspective, because you don't have to worry about it as much, because your characters going to know, like The Walking Dead. So when you come up on dead bodies versus the ones you saw animated 20 minutes ago, you're crushing their skulls in to be safe. Or you come up on this shack in the woods that is described exactly like the shack in The Evil Dead. Your character's even more creeped out, and he's more likely to, make sure that there's, a lock on the trap door, and then hesitant about opening the trap door, things like that.
So now, Steve Hill, how are you finding this, in terms of the Rails versus freedom balance?
Well, I think we talked about this a few episodes ago, maybe in a GM's corner when we used to do that. But I learned a long time ago not to overthink the entire adventure before you guys start playing. Because if I try to structure every single move that you're doing, then all you're doing is rolling dice to see if you hit the monster, right? And it gets boring. You feel like, I mean, you try all these different things, and I'm like, you can't do that. Well, you can't do that. You have to do this one thing that I've written. So, with that being said, the way I approach this game again was to give all the characters some kind of motivation for being in town and some decent backstory, so that you know what your mission is. Let's say, just as simple as that. Then I know, and I have created what is causing the problems, and I know what those things are. I know where the different players are in the game. So I know what the big boss battle is going to be like already, but how you get there can be a whole lot of different things. So a good example is after every night that we played, I would sit down, or at least before the next session, and write new stuff. So, for instance, all the tunnels under this town and the necromancy stuff, that was all based because you guys went a different direction. And I happened to be reading The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, an H.P. Lovecraft story at the time, and I thought, hey, I'm going to put a little something like that in my game. And actually, all of that stuff came, I hadn't planned any of that. That all came while we were playing. Sometimes when you guys do things, I think I'm pretty decent at creating things on the spot. So it may feel like something that's pre-planned, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes I'm just winging it. But I know the framework, in other words, of what's creating the problem in the town and what you need to get to the bottom of it. How you do that, that's all up to you. And then I have to react to what you say. And then sometimes it's confounding for you because you don't understand, why are these things not working? It's not because I want you to find that one thing. It's just I know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And then sometimes you surprise me. Maybe you'll say, I'm going to try this, and I'll think about it for a second. I'll be like, yeah, that would work. I could see that. So that's all part of just having a fluid game back and forth between the players and the game master. I've created this world. You guys are exploring it, and I'm rolling it out piece by piece. There's no set path to get to the end.
So I just want to touch on one last point before we sort of close out, because we've been going for a bit, which is knowing all the other games that you know, and the systems that you know. What do you think you would change if you were writing an eighth edition of this game?
I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't played it enough to know what I would change, if anything.
There aren't.
So this is peak Call of Cthulhu?
What's that?
Is this peak Call of Cthulhu? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, like, for instance, 7th edition added these new rule sets for a chase, whether it's a foot chase or in cars. They added a whole new rule system for that. I don't know.
You know what I would change about how we play, or how I play as a player in the future, is I never really used the luck or the push mechanics. And I think maybe those were put in to sort of help you along with those cases where you're doing investigation rolls, or from a player side.
Mm-hmm.
I probably should have used those more. I never used them because they're a new mechanic for me.
I forget that they're there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess I could remind you guys occasionally. Maybe I should do that moving forward. Say, hey, do you want to push that? And I've done that in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, if you fail your pushed roll, then it's a catastrophic failure of some type. So,
but that could be
fun.
I
think that's part of the problem with the mechanics for me, is that the risk reward means I'll just keep going, because if it's truly important, we'll figure it out eventually. Some way or somehow, because otherwise it's just not terribly important. And I think that's a challenge with a mechanic like that, is that how do you make it so people, oh yeah, I'm always do that, versus, so there has to be some negative aspects of doing it, I think. But at the same time, if it's too much, then you don't do it. And that's part of the reason. I think I remember when you talked about it, I thought, well, I'm not going to do that because the negatives sort of outweigh the positives most of the time.
Right. Well, and it's in the game manual itself. It tells, it gives advice to the game master, which in this game is known as the keeper of the lore. But in this game, it gives you kind of pointers about, for instance, if you're trying to open a door making a strength roll, that if you try to push, you fail, but you try to push the roll, then just maybe make it something really simple. If they have to get on the other side of that door somehow, it doesn't mean that you catastrophically fail and can no longer open the door. If it's integral to the plot, maybe just have them become injured because the shovel handle broke that you were trying to use for leverage. Little things. It can be, and then as a game master, I try to allude to what may, and to me in your mind, you're like, well, I'm going to try using that shovel, but if that handle breaks, that could hurt. And so I want to let you know ahead of time there could be consequences to pushing the roll.
You know what? It doesn't matter for me. I should just go ahead and do it because I'm going to end up in a wheelchair or, carrying around a thing of oxygen.
So
it's what we call him, Jimmy Lead Magnet Copenhagen.
So I think you said you might want to start wrapping it up. There's a couple things I wanted to cover before. I made a few notes. What I like the most about the way this game works is it's similar to Traveler in that your character does not level. Your character can improve skills that you have at the beginning of the game or develop throughout the game. But the fact that you don't level every couple of sessions, that if your character dies, then it's easy to re-roll one and jump right back into the group. I actually like that because you can improve your character by improving the skills so you feel like you're still getting somewhere. But at the same time, if one of the characters is killed, then you guys aren't on level 15, and then I've got to roll up a first level character. Or I say, go ahead and roll up a 15th level guy. Well, he's suddenly on level 15. He has no history. And I've always had an issue with that with Dungeons and Dragons, because I think that if you're going to play a game like this and it's all for fun, you got to make it a little dangerous. So occasionally, somebody's going to get it. I mean, that just adds to the role-playing aspect of it. I mean, I just think that makes it more fun from my point of view. I know there's players out there that probably hate that, but I think it makes it more fun.
Got to take out that daggone FBI agent. So, yeah.
Yeah. What characters need to get started? Potential players, if you're thinking about buying the game, all you really need to purchase is what's called the Call of Cthulhu Keeper's Rulebook. The retail price on that's about $55, but I picked it up on Amazon for about $40. I also bought another book called The Investigator's Handbook, which is sort of the equivalent of the Player's Handbook for, say, Dungeons and Dragons. And I expected it to have some spells and a whole bunch of extra stuff. To tell you the truth, you really do not need that book. It has a few reference charts in it, but it has quite a bit about life in the 1920s. It has a short story about H.P. Lovecraft in there. That book is really not necessary. Honestly, all you really need is the Keeper's Rulebook. The one rulebook, you can get started. It has everything you need. It has magic, monsters, generating characters. All of that is in the one book. So if you want to buy the other stuff as supplements or whatever, that's fine. But you just know that you don't need that to get going. And that's pretty much it, other than a few dice, percentile dice, and D6s mostly, and D10s, which are percentile dice.
Okay, is there anything else that anyone wanted to cover about Call of Cthulhu in this campaign?
No.
All right, so that's just a little bit of a delve into Call of Cthulhu and our experiences thus far. So we're still relatively new to this for most of us, Stephen excluded. And we're learning as we go along. Our campaign's about to end, and it'll be interesting to see how this goes into a follow-on campaign. Should we continue after this? Any of us survive the end? We'll let you know. If you have any thoughts about Call of Cthulhu or anything that we missed that we should have brought out, particularly if you're a big fan of the genre or the system itself, you can reach us at the contact information that are coming along later.
The end.
Jim here. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you spending your time with us. If you like the show, please take a moment to rate and review us wherever you listen to the podcast. It helps others find the show. You can find out more about the program over at our website at roleplaygeeks.com with links to all of our social media accounts. Until next week, keep your head down and stay away from strangers handing out multidimensional candy.